Dr. Silva is going to be talking to us about, let's see, you've called this revisiting the 2010s protest movements and organization and strategy in post-horizontalism. She's joined us. She's part of the core faculty and praxis program head at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and holds a PhD in sociology from the State University of Campinas in Brazil. You also got your BA and MA there, right? And a research and teaching center on the intersections of social and political theory, racial capitalism, social movements, political economy, and participatory democracy, with a sustained commitment to public scholarship and social justice. Right up our alley. We appreciate it. We're very anxious to hear what you have to say today. You also had a very late night, and so we're trying to make up for this with lots of coffee because she's been teaching since yesterday as well.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, folks, for having me. Pardon the that I have to have coffee as as I go. Long night. But yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation, this ongoing conversation, right? And I'm happy to contribute to what I think is like this making of collective imagination that that we are developing here. That I hope that we can all carry this forward beyond this moment. So I hope it's just one of many conversations that we'll have. So I want to start my remarks by first situating situating this reflection that I bring to you today, because I don't hold a traditional professorship position, right? So I work at an organization that is mostly, that mostly wants to offer knowledge to common people, right? Like to bring knowledge, bring the scholarship to people who are not necessarily in the university. Like they might be, but they may not necessarily be. And then my work then sits, at the intersection of academia and social movement consultancy. So that's what I do with the praxis head, as the praxis head at BISA. So what I consider myself a social movement scholar, then not simply because I study social movements, right, but because I try my best to support them, right, by helping organizers navigate scholarship and extract what might be useful to them, right, what might be useful for their work. So this presentation then is part of this effort of making the scholarship meaningful, right? To offer tools that help open up conversation, build shared vocabularies, and develop a common political horizon. I think this is all tasks that we have to engage with. So then, yes, I bring up here a reflection about the 2010s. And obviously, like, it's important, for us to bear in mind that decades that are not always, they are always somewhat abstract, like arbitrary, let's say, markers, right? We know that history doesn't unfold neatly, in 10-year like blocks, let's say. But when we focus on the 2010s in particular, right, we can say that those years made a decade of mass protests, right? So I'm sure that everybody here is familiar, have heard and or participated in one of these movements, right? Movements that happen all over the globe, right? So we started with Tunisia, right, that launched the Arab Spring. And then you have like Egypt, you have Spain, right, with the Indignados movement. You have the US with Occupy Wall Street. You have Mexico with ISO 832. You have Brazil, right, with the June journeys, right? You have Turkey with Gezi Park. You have Hong Kong. You have Taiwan. You have France, right? You have South Korea, you have Indonesia, you have Chile. So all of this, actually, I'm just like naming countries, right? Where you could, and this list is just partial, right? But I'm just naming countries where you have seen, between 2010 and 2020, you have seen, a wave of protest, like a level of mass protest there. And what I think is, but what is interesting about this years is not simply that all these countries had, had witnessed mass protests, but also that you have, in these countries, you see a common form, right, of unfolding. So to varying degrees, these protests were leaderless, right? Or at least they were committed to rejecting clear leadership. These protests were horizontally organized rather than top down, right? These protests were coordinated digitally through internet and social media. They usually occupied like public space, right? Like public squares, like had some intervention in the public space. And often the participants of these movements, they saw that effort. They saw the protest itself as prefigurative, right? As embody here and now the form, like the egalitarian, democratic, or even free society, if you want to say that these participants wanted to bring about, right? But today we have a very different scenario, right? With the rising of authoritarianism in this renewal turn to electoral politics, right? I think we are facing with a pressing question that I'm not sure if we dedicate ourselves as seriously to these questions, which is what remains, right? If anything, of this movement, right? What can we learn from this movement, right? I don't think it's reasonable that you have seen like millions on the street, right, taking to the streets across the globe, and we don't have a sustained conversation about this decade, right? Right? So the point here is not to bring original fieldwork or quantitative data to y'all, right? So what I want to do instead, what I do in this project, is to engage with some influential reflections, right? That some influential reflections on this protest cycle, especially those that emerged in the late 2010s and early 2020s, which I think like they have already like some sort of like breath, to it. They brought some sort of like, they were a little bit more detached, let's say, right? So I think they were able to have, a broader view of what this protest meant. So as you will see throughout this, 25 roughly minutes, like I will refer to 5 books, right, in this conversation. And I think, I'm going to be very honest, I think it's something that I want to bring, especially to this group, right, a group that that is thinking about, engaging with movements, right? Because what I don't have, like, I don't see, I generally see my contribution as a modest one, right? I don't bring, as I said, any original, like, field work or any original data to this conversation, right? But I also want to raise a point, right, which is in academia, originality, right, is often treated as the highest mark, right, of achievement, right? That is the highest mark of scholarship, is to be original, right? But yet, right, I think that what's actually needed, like most of the time, especially when you are working alongside movements, is not to produce something entirely new, but to actually think together, right? To translate complex ideas, to make existing knowledge useful for collective work, right? I think we take for granted like some of our skills, to be quite honest, right, that are actually very important and is not widely shared, right? The ability of connecting dots, right? Putting very simply, right? It's something that is not often spread, and we can bring that, so maybe, I think sometimes like just stepping back and say, okay, so what can I actually, like, can I translate these ideas? Is actually a lot of, like, it's a great contribution from a movement perspective, right? So in this sense, I believe that systematizing these reflections on the 2010s can illuminate some key questions, right, and key tensions that I think continue to haunt, right, movements, right, and how they understand organization, organizing, and political possibility, right? So I think one, especially when we think about analyzing a political moment, right, we have to account that our interpretation of a certain political moment, it can change, right? Memory is something is in the making. So I think the meaning of the 2010s, they have changed, like they have evolved. So mapping out these interpretations, right, isn't just an intellectual exercise. I think it's a political task to see how much actually, what these interpretations, are actually speaking, or what are they bringing, about the ways that movements are thinking. So I think I think it's interesting to also see by, considering which narratives become dominant, right? We understand which questions are the dominant questions. And of course, which questions are obscured and maybe we want to bring to the fore, right? So that being said, right, I want to explore, I want to start this exploration of these existing reflections on the 2010s with like speaking very much of horizontalism, right? So as I, briefly characterized a few minutes ago, right, the rejection of hierarchy and the embrace of broad participation and consensus were central to these movements of the 2010s. So the open assembly became this powerful symbol. And of course, it was, simultaneously a lightning rod of critique, right, for critique. So this first book, Organizing Occupy Wall Street, right, was written by a key organizer in New York, right, Marissa Holmes. And she seeks, to defend horizontalism from its detractors, right? That's the main goal of this book. And it's interesting, it's like the book that comes out later, among the five of these books, is that the one that comes out later. So the way that Holmes speaks about the movement, right, especially Occupy Wall Street, which is very much in the title, right, like she characterized the movement as internally divided, right? So the movement has an egalitarian ethos that was undermined not only by external repression, but also by the rise of informal elites from within, right, that were often masked as affinity groups, right, which was a very common type of internal organization of Occupy Wall Street. And then she said, like, actually these affinity groups, they became informal elites, right? They were instituted under the guise of decentralization and autonomy, which is very much what the movement was defending, right? But then, Holmes insists that Occupy was never against organization, right? It was against cooptation and top-down control. So then, like, this is actually a way of her bringing a prescription here, to us, because the point then, the lesson moving forward in her perspective, right, is that we need to build a more intentional democratic structure. So one that can resist both repression, but also internal dysfunction, right? So, and she insists on, countering a criticism, which is that the movement, the movement's relatively short existence shouldn't be mistaken for the absence of long-term thinking, right? The point in her perspective is that there is a mismatch there was a mismatch between aspiration, the movement's aspiration, and the movement infrastructure, right? So Occupy's political imagination, right, this desire for radical inclusivity, for radical democracy, for collective decision-making, right, it far outpaced the organizational forms and the logistical capacities to sustain it, right? So it's almost like the ideals were too expensive, right? But the means to give them were fragile and underdeveloped, right? So that's, her assessment of the moment. And of course, we can definitely engage with this. Like, we can debate whether this fully, engages with the deeper criticisms, right? The deeper limitations of the movements and the critiques that it has received. But I think for now, what I want to point out, especially in light of the fact that this is the latest, book to come out, it's interesting to see that she is intentionally responding to what has become one of the most widely interpretations of Occupy and its counterparts, which is, a view that was crystallized. Put the other side. It was a view that was crystallized, with this book, Zeynep Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas, which was published in 2017, right? It was actually interesting, the first of this movement. So, of the first of these books. So around 2015, you start to see a churn, it's not as homogeneous during the decade, but you start to see a churn, which is, activists who once camped in parks began to turn to institutions, right? So that's when you actually have the rise of figures like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, right? So, and there was a growing sentiment, which was, translated in this idea that movements must move into politics, right? So how do we explain that? So Tufekci says that, this digital era movements like Occupy, they can scale up, right, with unprecedented speed, but they often struggle to scale deep, right? So these are two different moves that a movement, two different moves that a movement can make. A movement can scale up, but a movement can scale deep. And Occupy and its counterparts were able to do one, but not the other, right? So what does that mean to scale deep? In this case, they were not able to scale deep. They were not able to build the organization resilience, needed to adapt, needed to endure. So she describes this condition through this element called tactical freeze, right? Which is when, movements can mobilize. They can mobilize like massive crowds through online channels, but they struggle to decide what to do once the crowds are indeed in the streets. So people come out, but once you are in the streets, nobody actually knows what to do. So unlike past movements, it's interesting, right? Because then this actually raises questions about how we actually assess a movement. Because unlike past movements, right, which were judged exactly by visible outcomes, right? Like how we used to judge a movement before the 2010s, right? Is that if you have a lot of people on the streets, if you have like a large demonstration, if you have like even like policy changes, etc., right? So this was a sign of like success. But Tufekci then said that this actually gets twisted, once you put internet into the mix, because now we have to assess these movements, right, by considering its underlying capabilities, right? Can these movements make decisions collectively? Can they sustain participation? Can they shift tactics as the conditions change, right? So this brings us, a different way of evaluating movements that we have to take seriously, right? So in this sense, her critique of horizontalism is not ideological, let's say, oh, horizontalism, is good or bad, or, it's democratic or not democratic. Like, that's not her point. Like, her point is the critique of horizontalism is like entirely functional, let's say, right? Like, if whether it works or not. So, and she says, like, because these movements, they lack mechanisms for formal mechanisms, right, for deliberation and coordination, they risk stalling, right? They stall because, when the political terrain beneath them shifts, right, they get stuck. So in this sense, when you think about the rise of horizontalism starting in the mid-decade, right, this is not an accident, then it's a symptom of these organizational shortcomings, right, and this sometimes silent, but sometimes very open recognition of these limits. So then, if you compare, for example, Tufekci and Holmes, right, these two books that I spoke to thus far, like Holmes believes that it's possible to fix, these structures, be more intentional about them, right? But Tufekci doesn't think that that's the point, right? The problem isn't simply that horizontal movements lacked time or resources to consolidate, right? She says these structures, they actually they resist the consolidation, right? So they are actually, these movements are bound to reach a plateau, right? They can ignite, but they cannot sustain. So now, but now then I want to add myself, right? Like a caveat here, right? Because I think that, we should add, even amid this turn toward institutions, right? I think we should be careful because electoral politics may have regained attention, right? As someone coming from New York, I can 100% say that, so definitely we have this shift that Tufekci acknowledges is there, right? However, it is a mistake to say that horizontalism lost, its appeal. Like, horizontalism hasn't fully disappeared, right? When we think about COVID, for example, you had, a bunch of decentralized networks, organizing mutual ways, right? That, rescued exactly this ethos of remarkable speed, remarkable, flexibility. And I think it's interesting that I think we should take even like Tufekci's own assessment seriously, because she says something important, which is horizontalism. Like, we have to take that as almost like a cultural shift, right? Like, people want to feel that they are in a horizontal, like a top-down structure is not exactly the most appealing structure to people, right? So horizontalism persists, even if not in identical forms, it's still there. So I think the real story here shouldn't be one of defeat, right? Or evolution or maturation, as her book tries to present, but it's much more like, I think that we have to sit with these enduring tensions of models of organizing, right? That are still there. So this, and I think, like, what can we take out of this tension? When you look at movements, there is actually a silent acknowledgement of this tension. But that brings us, to a conversation about the broad political environment and what a long-term horizon means, right? And I think the next book, If We Burn, right, by Vincent Bevins, poses a very interesting, question that relates this model of organizing to the large political environment, because he asks, right, why did so many of the decade's mass protests produce the outcomes that were actually opposite of what these movements were asking, right? So what do I mean? In country after country, right, from Egypt to Brazil, movements opened up political space, but this political space was occupied by reactionary forces. you know? So there is a pattern here, right? Movement, this move into the 2010s, right? It's not simply that these movements looked alike. I think what we have to consider is that this protest erupted, like what we have is a pattern, right? Protests erupted over a grievance. They gathered broader support, but then they splintered when they could no longer hold together the diversity that they brought, that they brought in. So what I say, like, in a way of summarizing this, there was a shakeup that lacked follow through, right? They shook up things, but there was nothing that followed, that shakeup. So there was no roadmap to connect mass mobilization to structural change. So there is no right even reform here, right? And the result is that the right wing filled the gap. The movements themselves could not fill. So so that's why, that's why we have, this, and it's a pattern, right? It's seen in many countries that reactionary forces came actually to the fore. So Bevins is even more explicit than Tufekci, right, in his assessment, because to him, right, movements must overcome their suspicion of representation and commit to building formal organizations that are capable of, in his words, contesting power, right? And his main case study for, defending this thesis is Chile, right? Where you actually had former student leaders that became part of that became, that rose to office, right? Including the press, like Gabriel Boric was one of protesters. Camila Varela was one of the protesters. So this is, this is his assessment of the decade. But then, I think, again, inviting for a pause here, like playing devil's advocate, because electoral success, as history has constantly shown, is not synonyms with a structural transformation, right? So the capture of state offices doesn't automatically or necessarily lead to a structural transformation, systemic transformation, right? And I think something else that we should sit with, like, because he mentions a lot in the book the idea of contesting, power, contesting for power. But like, what is power, right? It seems that, he's associating, like, as, as a result of this decade, he's very much associating power, to state office. But are we reducing power to state power, So are we sitting with that? I think that, obviously that what Bevins identify as a way forward may in fact, like, expose a deeper dilemma, right? When we criticize horizontalism, are we saying that the solution lies in entering institutions? Or are we saying that the solution lies in the construction of durable majorities, right? And collective capacities that can shift the political landscape itself. These are two different questions. Like, they are connected, right? But they are not the same, right? Much of the critique of the 2010s has revolved around the alleged absence of strategy. So that's, he said, like, we didn't have a strategy because we didn't reach office. But then I think we have a question that we readily unpack, we take for granted. What do we actually mean by strategy? I'm not sure if we know the answer to this question. We talk so much about strategy, like, what does that mean, right? And that's why I think that it's interesting to think with Rodrigo Nunes, right? Because he has this book called Neither Horizontal, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, right? And I think he argues in this book that our conversation about the 2010s has become stuck in false binaries, right? Horizontalism versus vanguardism, spontaneity versus discipline, heat versus office, right? And instead, he proposes that we fully accept an ecological view of organization and organizing, right? So movements, he writes, are not singular structures, but constellations. So we have to think here about we have to think of different actors, different roles, different relationships, right? So from this perspective, strategy is not owned by one node, but is distributed across a complex ecosystem, right? And he says coordination then matters. So does pluralism, right? So strategy or strategic thinking more precisely, right, is a collective function of a network. It's not let's say, it's not the line of any movement, right? When we think about strategy, we have to think of strategy as a collective effort, not something that one movement has, one organization has, and another one doesn't, right? So, and I think that, it's interesting for us to, to sit with that, what this may actually, like elaborate a little bit on its implications, right? Because then what he's arguing is that we don't need to have a unified, let's say, theory of change in which everyone, does their part, right? So movements, like when he says that movements are an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem or an ecological view of movements is not a fancy way of saying division of movement labor, okay? Like he's trying to, like he's inviting us rather to support a plurality of coexisting experiments in which contact doesn't necessarily exist, right? Which, what I think is interesting, because today we don't have a strong anchoring institutions anymore, anymore, or even I'm not sure if to what extent we can say that in the US, but anchoring institutions like a mass party or, trade unions, like these are, I mean, I'm not saying that they are irrelevant, but they are not anchoring institutions that guides everybody's views. It's just one, institution, one movement, one organization among many, right? So when we think about, right, an ecology here, thinking about a plurality of experiments, that's very interesting because, yes, we don't have a strong magnet that guides the vision of everybody. So to some extent, everybody has to be doing their work, right? But at the same time, right, I think we cannot ignore challenges that, that are part of this view of a movement ecosystem, which is how do we complement and integrate each other's work better? Right? If nobody has the line, like if nobody has the line, if nobody's going to say, okay, this is what the left is going to do, follow along, how do we coordinate the multiple efforts that we think that he says that need to come, that need to come? How do we handle and coordinate across difference, right? And how do movements learn, recalibrate, and sustain themselves in the long run? Right? We have to think about that. And I think that, and then to wrap up, I think that is interesting that the final book in this conversation is Isabelle Garro's Communism and Strategy, which I think, and I say it's interesting because this is the only book that is not explicit about the mass protest decade per se, but the proposals are steeped in the resurgence of the critique of capitalism that the 2010s brought about, in this idea that we have to have a long-term horizon, right? So for her, a strategy then is not a fixed blueprint, right? A strategy requires forms of collective mobilization, yes, but a strategy requires, in her perspective, historical analysis and reflective political spaces, right? So we don't, like, boiling this down a little bit, like we don't think much about the work. We do we readily reflect on the work that we are doing. So a strategy then must be grounded in questions like, what is this era in which we are living, right? What forces shape this conjuncture in which we are? What are we trying to achieve in this moment, right? So a strategy here is an ongoing, open-ended process where the path and the horizon are constantly, reconsidered, debated, revised, and reimagined collectively. So where does this leave us to end, right? So I want to advance a few core, arguments as a result of this exploration of these reflections, right? I think first is that, the 2010s protest movements, they were they were not, they must not be ready in terms of their short-term outcomes, but rather as generative moments that posed durable questions about organization, organizing, and collective action in the 21st century. So, just a proof of that is how much I've been speaking here for half an hour, just, raising questions. That's what they were very generative. Second, right, I think we have to acknowledge seriously that while the return of electoralism and the rise of authoritarianism have reshaped the political landscape, they should not be read as a wholesale rejection of horizontality and democratic experimentation, right? What we see instead is this ongoing tension and unresolved tension between divergent organizing logics, right? Structure and spontaneity, participation and efficiency, process and outcome. Movements are still navigating this today, and we still don't have a practical answer to this tension. And third, I think we have to think about what the word strategy actually means, right? So we need to approach strategy not as a settled doctrine or buzzword, which, I have this, like by working with movements, I have this strong sense that strategy became a buzzword, right? But I think we have to think about strategy rather as a collective inquiry, right? So you can see that each of these authors that I brought up here, they have their own definition, their own understanding of what strategy means, right? So Bevins links the strategy to institutional access. Nunes sees strategy as distributed and always emergent. And Garro emphasizes strategy as historical awareness and ideological clarity. So, and I think interesting that each author brings a piece of a larger puzzle, right? So strategy as capture, strategy as constellation, and strategy as critique and horizon. So the challenge is to think about all of this together, to hold all these components together, right? So how do we actually link, action to analysis, root imagination in material conditions, and we keep at the same time the horizon open for adjustment. So in this sense, right, obviously here to reinforce the point, you can see that returning to the 2010s is not a nostalgic gesture, right? As I said in the beginning, I think of this as a political necessity, right? So we have here pressing unfinished questions, and maybe the most pressing of this question is still the oldest question, right? What do we mean by, what does it mean to build an alternative to the current system, right? How do we organize not just against the present, but also towards a future that is radically unknown, right? What should be the role of scholars in this process, in light of the assessment that I just presented? Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. I'm sure we have lots of questions and comments. So we'll
keep
going.
Great.
Keep going. Let's see. Let's start in the room, and then we'll go on. And
so thank you very much for this interesting topic. It brings a lot of sad memories. I was back in Egypt in 2011 in Tahrir Square, and all of the question that you posed, and you know, the problems that the mobilization and the protest movement, it's always there. So, and I kind of like, you know, it's 15, almost 15 years now, and we're still where we were before, even worse in Egypt, for example, and it's many in many countries in the Middle East. Tunisia, you know, had like a bitter past back then, but then now we're seeing the the implication of the electoral politics. You know, a president that is crazy, and you know, everything is going backwards. So, and you know, I thought a lot about what went wrong in that. You know, and it's just like, you know, you mentioned many of those factors. You know, lack of mobilization, I'm not so, sorry, lack of leadership, and uh, and a lot of people in Egypt were talking about it failed because we didn't have a leader. But at the same time, when some of the, you know, parts of the movement try to engage in the formal politics and engage, somehow they uh, co-opted in a way or another, or they didn't have enough, or because the rule of the game are already set by the people in power, so they weren't able to do anything. So I'm still questioning this problem. So did we need a leader back then, or we didn't? Do we need a leader now? But the problem is, like, the context itself is not, will not enable the rise of any new leader. So, I'm still like, you know, questioning. So, what would be the solution for this dilemma? Because you are in a setting that is already being the rules of the game are being set by the existing regime, and you don't have like a stronger, a stronger figure or public figure or a leader or a protest or an opposition leader who people come around, you know, they can come around him and, you know, can negotiate. So I think the solution, or like, you know, the moment that we miss in Egypt back then, that we had this leader, his name is Mohammed al-Baradei. He was like an international figure, and he had a moment that a lot of people were behind him, but he said, I'm not going to jump on the gain that we got because of, you know, sorry, and the gain that the youth at that time like had, and I will let them lead. But those people were not experienced enough. So yeah. So I wonder what could be the I know that you're asking a question, and everyone is asking a question on all of these folks, but we have this dilemma of informal politics versus mobilization, horizontalism, you know, versus structure, and having a clear structure, clear leadership that can lead the way. And I believe we should have some sort of organization, and this organization should allow some sort of people coming together, creating a leverage, and negotiate with the existing power structure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do anything, because the mobilization itself is not sufficient to overcome, is not sufficient and strong enough to negotiate with the power structure, existing power structure, because they already, like, they set the rule of the game, they set how the election are being done, they engineer the election itself, and you don't have a leverage, you don't have a social base that can enable you to negotiate.
Yeah, I think that the case of Egypt is actually quite sad, right? Especially considering like that was one of the first, and then see the situation today. First, I think when you think about the changes, like the political terrain, getting to today, I would even question if anyone emerged at this point, if they would be able to do anything. Because as you said, like there was, you have like even if you want to dispute the op, is it even possible at in this situation? Given that that you actually have an authoritarian regime. How do you actually confront that? So I think like at this point, it's almost like, well, you see how, consequential some moves are, because now the conjuncture is different, it's different. Yeah. And then we have to come to terms with that of like, okay, now, there's a different political terrain. Some tactics are not going to work. So we have, and I'm not sure if we have, if the movement, let's say the left, the opposition, let's put it, the opposition is organized enough to actually have a reflection on, you know, on what the moment is, you know, and then just bring into the talk here, right? Part of the conversation that I think Bevins brings up, and we can see with Gajo, is that we have to make an assessment, like part of the mistake with movements is to actually think of in terms of formulas.
Yeah.
You know, like do X plus Z equals this thing, you know? So, for example, if we bring a lot of people to the streets equals change. You know what I mean? So like we functioning very much in terms of formulas, when in fact, political analysis is not formula, you know, is assessing what what forces are at play, you know, and sometimes actually forces don't mean the same in different historical moments, right? Just to say, like, to use the example of elections, right? To use the example of democracy, we have until like the beginning of the 2010s, we still have some level of liberal consensus here, right? In terms of like, what is that democracy is important, you know, that, dispute. That's not the situation now. So the effectiveness of protest today is not the same as in the past. So then if you think like, just to bring here, like if you think about, oh, let's do this gigantic march, and it happened, right? A few weeks ago in many places. What does that mean?
Exactly.
You know, it doesn't mean the same because protest today doesn't mean the same. You know, being people on the street doesn't mean, and we have to come to terms with that. There's some tactics just don't work in this era, right? So this is one point. And then to bring back to the, to how things unfolded in Egypt. I think the issue here, like you said, oh, because we didn't have a leader. You can frame things this way, but at the same time, let's actually think a little bit more. If anyone had reason, would they be able to represent the movement? You know, would the movement have accepted a leader back then?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think the example of Turkey is actually very interesting because the government, like, what was the spark for the movement in Turkey, right? It was Gezi Park.
Mm-hmm.
And then people occupied Gezi Park. And then at one point, the government was like, okay, let's chat, right? Let's talk. Let's, you want this park? Let's talk. There was no one.
Mm-hmm.
There was no one. And the people who came to become like representatives of the movements were not accepted by the movement.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have so basically actually, and that benefited the government a lot because they basically the government could say, we are negotiating with this movement, right? But the movement didn't accept their representatives, So even if someone had reason in Egypt, I imagine that something similar would have happened, that these people would not have the legitimacy, the backup of the people on the street, because there is a strong, and the decade was marked by this strong resistance against leadership, right? So, so then now the question then becomes, right? How do we think about leadership? If we take seriously the fact that, as I said, like, horizontalism hasn't fully disappeared and people want to feel invested, and feel that they have a direct say in the movements. How do we think about leadership in these conditions? How do we think about the accountability process here between a leader and a movement? And how do we actually think about, interacting with institutions in a context in which people walk in the context, let's say, of a little bit of horizontalism. So if we have, like, how do we think about a movement, right? How do we think about movements that are, that don't necessarily have a top-down structure, but at the same time, how do we think about that and interact with state power? Because state power is not going to go away.
No.
At least as of now. you know, as for the time being, it's not going away, you know. So how do we think about that, you know? So I think a lot of times, right? And I think the question actually, you know, is not only like the type of, it's not simply horizontalism and top down, right? But I think it's very much like interacting with the state. You know, how do we think about this interaction, which is an old question, right? It's not a new question, it's an old question that has been refashioned today. Because honestly, you can think about a movement that, like if you can approach like the way that Marisa Holmes was trying to approach Occupy, right? That you can have, for example, you don't, horizontalism doesn't need to mean of assemblies all the time. You can think about different like tiers, let's say, right? You can have different spaces like an assembly and a spokes council, for example, right? And or an assembly of representatives, etc. The point is that, you know, a lot of folks who came to the 2010s, and I think this is very much a product of the internet, associated horizontalism with full individualism. You know, and I think that that's, you know, that's a problem with this era, right? How much actually social media, internet is a large tool for mobilization, like people get fired up by it, but at the same time, to what extent it's actually fostering some like values that are detrimental for movement building, because it's strongly individual, right? So like, I want to go to the protest, I want to participate, I want to bring my sign, I want to feel good, I want to, you know, so it's all about me, you know. And I'm not blaming like people, it's just the fact, you know, it's just a consequence of this means of this channel of recruitment. You know, you recruit people on an individual basis, obviously then they are not going to feel a connection.
Yeah.
So we have, so what can we make out of that? Honestly, maybe we should like go back to like recruiting people in the old-fashioned way, you know, like old-fashioned way, like, you know. Just to bring up yesterday's talk, I was talking to Ben. I was very impressed, you know, by the level of critical mass that is here, right? People wanting to participate. And I think we need to recruit people in the old-fashioned way, you know, not simply social.
It needs to be more disruptive, honestly, because I agree with you. You go to a protest, you know, everyone is feeling happy, we scream, you know, no kings, and everyone goes home and nothing changed. And, you know, this performance, you know, I hated about activism because you know, and I think this is one of the tools that the liberal system somehow co-opted the protest movement. Will give you a space in a specific time at a certain arena, you go protest, scream and do whatever you want, and you feel good about yourself, you go back, so you don't feel the same anger that you have against the system anymore. So, and you know, disruption here, you know, I don't know what that means. Of course, we don't need violence, but disruptive politics in a way or another that makes the regime, the system give some concession.
Exactly.
I think we have
Michael, did you have a question?
No,
Maybe we could do
nothing
a
for me.
couple.
This is great though.
Okay, great. Anna, did you, or
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were talking about the Nunez book, like about the ideological and like the movement diversity, also about that applying to organizations themselves. Because I don't know, like I'm a DSA member, so I think I just was wondering, like, do you think it should be a model for the left to like be encouraging like ideological diversity in like our organizations as opposed to like straight like democratic centralism, like, or do you think that's also like another kind of false binary, like to be like Big Tent versus centralist?
What do you mean ideological diversity would be Big Tent?
Yeah, like Big Tent, kind of like that kind of like, do you think that should be a model for like left organizations to be successful, or do you think I'm just setting another kind of binary in between like having like a party line and having like a Big Tent view, if that makes sense?
Yeah, interesting, because
Because I think like the concept that Nunez was saying was like applying to like a movement as a whole, but I guess I'm thinking of it as like more narrow and like one.
Yeah,
large
so like
organization.
if we should like replicate this idea of like an ecosystem implies diversity,
Yeah.
right? An ecosystem, you have different, organisms, right? So then would we replicate this inside the organization? I would say if we follow his rationale, I would say yes, right? Because then the point is to actually, if we can, in his perspective, if we can execute, right, like the experiments, so if the organization, like the organization wouldn't need to like think exactly the same in order to put an experiment together. But that's different from an organization that is trying to run and dispute state power. I think it is different because it implies that there is a dispute for a platform, for policies that are going to be pushed forward. So I don't think it's the same as, for example, a movement like working on the ground, trying to think about a campaign, or even more broadly, thinking about a long-term project of counter institutions, because that, when you have a campaign, when you have a counter institution project, it means that you do have some sort of, let's say, you have a horizon, and people can guide their work towards making that happen or not. But I think with state power, I think it's more difficult, so then it depends on, like, if DSA is an organization that wants, to dispute state power, and all power to it, like, good for it. Good, but if you don't know what the platform is going to be, the organization simply cannot propose that,
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's the thing. But then DSA could be part, if you follow this line, his rationale could be part of a movement ecosystem, here. So in the sense that it would be part of shifting the political terrain, but obviously the role of the organization would be doing that through state intervention, through policies, etc. And then what we would need to have is a coordination, between the policies and what the movements are, are doing. And then I think the question is it going to be a organic relationship between state and movements to the point that both are going to be open to each other's push, or is going to be what happens in many places, which is the office dictating what's going to be done, state power, dictating what the landscape's going to be, or the other way around.
And in your case, you've also got a mediating university as an institution, so which is also, as a public university, you've got a governor who appoints our board of visitors, it's weighing heavy on
I was
governance.
referring to DSA as like the national organization.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as your own role
Yeah.
here on campus, where you also can be, are you thinking Big Ten
Yeah,
locally?
exactly.
So some of Nunez's work, as you described, it remind me a little of Roberto Unger. And the same idea that let many democratic experiments move, especially in the knowledge economy.
Yeah.
But and I see that tension too, because there's, at what point are you able to start thinking together about a collective way forward vision. But at the same time, he's arguing, I sense, Nunez too, that there is no alternative roadmap that you can just put out there and expect everyone to come to, because that's, you didn't build it yet. And frankly, there's so much power to fight against it. It's not going to fall apart instantly, even though we can say it's unsustainable. We watch it slowly falling apart to some extent.
Yeah, interesting. Like the way that you see Nunez's work, which I think actually is very friendly to, like, we've had this conversation, right? Very much, like, very friendly to this perspective of new system, next system studies, right? Because in his perspective, yes, you don't have like a party line, you don't have a line that everybody's gonna follow, you don't have an organization that is gonna, or a movement, right, that is going to be able to take this role. It's just, in his perspective, it's just impossible, especially in the world that we have today, right? In which you have like internet, as I said, you don't have like a left, like capital L project, right? You don't have a Soviet Union anymore. You don't have, you know what I'm saying? Like, you don't have none of that. So you have in a world, we live in a world of multiple movements. So, and no movement is going to be able to dictate what the others are going to do. However, right, what he says, it is possible to actually be in position in situations in which you have almost like heavies, you know? So then, for instance, imagine this is a movement landscape. So it means that each of us are going to be doing our work, but we have to be attuned to the work of each other, right? And that means that at one point, your work is going to get a lot of traction. So everybody has to be aware of this work and understand that it's getting a lot of traction and redirect that energies to that. So once this moment is passed, you know, another wing is gonna get traction. And then all of us have to redirect our energy, you know, to that. That's why I said that this is interesting, but at the same time, you still have challenges, because we have to think about coordination, communication, and diversity, right? How do we accept that? And I'm going to put very bluntly, like, we also have to think about relinquishing movement ego, right? In the sense of, like, some moments, yeah, your work is not going to be the hot one, you know, like, it's not going to be the hot one. And you have to know that, right? That, let's say, for example, in one moment, you do have a strong, you know, shift in, you know, in what is it called? Like housing, let's say, right? So your work is not in housing, whatever, you know, but that's the hot work. And then you work, for example, with education. So what can you do? What can your work do to support and to leverage that, you know, because that's going to bring us to a different.
But also there is also interest and ideology, you know.
Sure.
You know, Egypt and Tunisia, the Islamists, they were part of the protest movement, but at some point their interests aligned with the existing power structure. So in Egypt, they aligned up with the army, and they ended up the army turning against them and pushing them, and then now most of them are in jails. So different interests between the different movement also will play a role in keeping the movement like the overall movement dispersed. And also, you know, the state are using this technique to infiltrate and create their own movement as well. So they go in, create differences, and, you know, the movement fails. I'm sorry, like, I'm keep like so bleak, but this, I have seen this firsthand in Egypt and in other countries, which make me very critical of the current state of mobilization and movement. And we need to think creatively and, you know, to have more imagination, how to come up with new form of organization that can, you know, overcome these challenges.
Yeah.
Just on that, and also just want to ask, was there anybody else?
I think she wasn't.
Oh, I'm sorry, you know.
Yeah. All right. Very brief comment, and then I'll be very brief. Just to say that what you were just describing has come out of the research that Omar and I and others have been doing in the Next Constitutions Research Lab, looking at these 26 cases of constitutional revolutions. And we have this model of movement and counter movement, democracy movement as a way of symbolizing really the social movement, and then authoritarian movement, you know, movements towards authoritarianization as the broad counter movement. It's really for the anti-social movement, to think about it in another way. But there's, what's become very clear is there's a third movement, which is also associated with the liberal or center position, which is really the modernizer state, national movement. And so I just want to echo what you're saying. So in terms of the question of pluralism, right? You know, the like in Hanan's question earlier, in terms of the types of diversity in ecological approaches that we take, I think it just depends. Like I think there is a broad sort of like what you're talking about is that they were not our movement, right? Exactly. They were not. Exactly. They were the counter movement. But then within our movement, the social movement, or with the democracy movement and all the aspects of the social movement, capital S, capital M, there at different levels, there's different kinds of diversity that should be nurtured within organizations. So, for example, within the Greens, the tension between the Rialos and the Fundis was treated as a problem, but I always thought it should be treated as a dynamic positive, right? Or DSA, should be thinking of itself as a big tent, in my view, right? But within certain
certain
limits, right? And even the democratic centralist organizations, I remember the ISO and Socialist Alternatives, so they have currents within them, and most people don't know about it, but they're actually organized to have those debates. So, sorry,
I
Jane.
like to distinguish though between ideology and values. So we do have to know our values, and that does shape your limits, right?
Yes, yes.
And your values shift and evolve or whatever, change over time, and that happens through conversations with others. So that's reason to also be humble, or to be able to listen and not just ready to make your argument.
There is even a very broad ideological coherence to the social movement, if you think about it. Even if there's a normative orientation that's common, it's just levels of coherence and stability.
Yeah, and that allusion to the normative dimension is also an allusion to the values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gina.
No, my question was more of advice than a question. So I study Bangladesh, and we had a massive mass uprising last year that actually led to the fall of a government who ruled for 15 years. And it was a student-led movement, and now those students formed a political party and they're running for election. That's anticipated to be next year. And there are also controversy about their ideologies and how they are now organizing it post-movement, post-regime change context, because now they also have to, negotiate with other political parties and people with different views and ideologies. Even though my core focus is cybersecurity laws and freedom of expression, but I cannot study that without studying the broader reform processes and institutional structuring that's going on. And there are also lots of power play in those institutions. So my question is, what do you think are the key areas or aspects that I should keep my eyes on as I'm studying a social issue while it's still unfolding? I'm not anything that's already happened, and I'm not focusing on the past. So what are the aspects that I should keep?
So you want to study this shift from movement, strictly movement, to these folks who are actually running for power. And your focus is on this group, how they see this, you want to understand their view of the process.
They are already part of the process.
Okay.
They are already part of the interim government that we have. That's not an elected government, and they're running for office. So that's going to change a lot of things as well.
Yeah, interesting, because I actually remember when I started studying Occupy, because it was actually something that was also moving, and there is actually, for doing research in anything that is in process of change, right? Something that is recent, what I would say, your research has to give room exactly for, to the fact that it's fluid, So a lot of times with our research, especially on movements, we want to capture, a moment. And what we have to try to do somehow is to record a movie, So then what I would say, to me, the easiest way of trying to capture a movie is to try to zoom out, right? So this is not about these specific folks per se, but how they are positioned in a larger field, So if you try to focus on these people, right? Or if you try to focus on this group, this might stuck your research because you're going to isolate the group. So this group has to be part of a landscape. So your focus is the landscape. It's interestingly, your focus is not the movement per se, it's the political terrain that gave rise to this movement. Because that will allow you to see what forces are at play, So then, for example, my research with Occupy, and this was 10 years ago, I remember being very, conflicted because I was like, oh my gosh, like I came here and I wasn't here in 2011. I came later. And then everybody, why are you here? This movement is even over. And I was like, I felt like terrible. I thought that my research was completely gonna, crumble. But that was, but the interesting thing was like to think, in my case, actually, what worked is the fact that I focus on the movement structure. Here comes from my research on Occupy and movement structure, because that allowed me to see that the movement was not one group or another, but was exactly the connections that made up. So in your case, since I don't think that these were protests that were going to the street, the disruption. As far as I know, they didn't try to build like an occupation or anything like that, right? It was a wave of protests that disrupted power. So in this case, like the movement structure doesn't matter that much, but the political landscape does a lot, because then you're gonna see, how does this group is positioned in the broad landscape in the beginning of this process, in the middle, and in the end. This is gonna help you a lot, I think.
Thank you.
I wanna just tell you that I think this presentation is just brilliant, and I think it almost felt like a New York review of books. Books, really well done and tied together, and I think you should consider publishing it.
Yeah, no, I'm putting this together. I've been writing since writing a little bit, bits and pieces of this piece, since we met, 6 months ago. And yeah, I think very much in these lines of some sort of review of books. And to bring back the point that I brought in the beginning, I think we actually don't value that much the power of reviews.
Yeah, I do.
Of reviewing, because I think that we think a lot, as I said, we think a lot of movement scholars. We think a lot about oh my gosh, I need to find out this new thing. I need to find out, I have to give this, insightful analysis that nobody did, about this movement. But as I said, as I did here, I didn't bring anything, what I did was basically take the author's words and take them very seriously, so what, and expanding that. And if we do that as people who are working with movements and people who want to work with movements, you don't realize how much of a contribution that is for them.
That was the brilliant part, because that was your main opening point. We've got to be connecting the dots and mapping
exactly to them, because you get
what you're doing in the review as well.
Exactly. When you get to I hosted a study group lately, it's been we wrapped up 3 weeks ago on Bevins, If We Burn. So we read the whole book together, just activists, right? And how much actually that was helpful to them, in terms of, and we read the book and we talked about it, just discussing ideas what is a liberal consensus, right? What is a movement repertoire, which is, a lot of us, who are in movement scholarship, we take to these ideas of movement repertoire and then we just talk about this as just this most common and obvious idea of the world, and a lot of times movements like to hear that. It's there is a repertoire. Yes, it's a toolkit. And obviously they recognize that because they do that. But then when you sort of, shed light on the idea, yeah, it's very helpful because they start to think about it. So it's a repertoire. It's not so there is a history to that. We learned how to protest. And that means that we don't need to do things always the same way. So it means that we can actually think about different ways, questions that, for people who are involved in the work, not saying that they don't think, it's just because they are they have to do so much that unfortunately there is no space for thinking, for reflection, and that's part of our job is to help with that. We are paid to do that.
Part of what I took from your theory too is that setting this in the 2010s as an era,
Yeah,
is that there's a structure to that has changed. And these repertoires, part of the theory behind that is that they have structural limits that
Absolutely.
produce the boundaries of these
Mhm.
repertoires to some extent, but they have changed in the past. And you're suggesting as the era is changing, we actually have to create new repertoires.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, I think that the 2010s was the exhaustion of the repertoire
The
of
90s.
of the 60s even, you know? Like when you think about like the whole way that you think about not everything, but like the very idea, like what actually emerged with the 60s, especially with the rise of mass media, is to actually visible display of dissent, right? So
A protest culture, you're saying.
exactly, a
Yeah,
protest
yeah,
culture of like a visit. So then you don't make a protest like here, right? Because nobody's gonna see. You have to go to like this big intersection in which everybody goes to see. And this is part of like what rose up with the 60s and the rise of mass media. If you think about like Selma, the entire civil rights, like repertoire is grounded also in mass media response. We don't have that today because like the internet has segmented the narrative, right? And we have a rise of authoritarianism, so you can put like millions of people on the street, and as we just like we've seen that like literally nothing.
The revolution will not be.
Like literally nothing happened on the next day. Like it was
But what I think is happening there is I think that people who are orchestrating No Kings are very aware of that, and it's not to be quite as cynical, because I've been trying to figure this out, having lots of conversations. It's not that they're trying to contain sort of protest activity and demobilize people and off times. It is that they have a theory which actually is consistent with something that I put out with Michael Heaney last year, which is about the role of these mobilizations in changing the debate and reframing elections and preparing people for mobilization around elections. So their rhythm is actually tuned very well for building a majoritarian political coalition that is not scary and that actually helps them to win elections, which is a shift for that constellation of people. So that from what they were doing before, where they were actually kind of terrified of turning people out. But that's obviously not the only thing we need to be doing.
But you can see that, but you see how interesting that the street action has a different role now.
Yes, exactly. It's not the same.
It's a different.
It's not about protest to affect
so it's
policymakers.
It's
right?
exactly. It's not about the action. So then that's the thing. If it's part of a long-term strategy for just like getting people out and thinking, but that's a different thing.
That's a different thing.
It's a different thing. It's not, and we are. But we have to be aware of that.
Right.
That protest is not for achieving. A response. A response.
Demands.
Protest becomes actually. I think it's interesting if you think from the perspective that there is a silent acceptance of the fact that protest has become a recruiting mechanism, which is different from the past, in which protest was the outcome. So recruitment happened before, So if you came to the protesting before, it's because you were with that movement. Now you come out because you are interested in something, and then you have, I think that's an interesting point because
solidarity maintenance too.
And I think a lot of folks, especially on the movement scenes, they let's say they regret from the 2010s the fact that they didn't have pipelines of absorption.
Or sufficient ones.
Exactly. Sufficient ones. Not that they didn't have any, but like the people would come to the street, but there was no organization to absorb them to do something in the future.
Do you think that's also like in the United States, it's kind of a product of like the Obama movement in 2008? Because I think that was like a really big failure of like volunteer, like
Millennials.
Yeah.
All of them.
Like, did you say? I feel like that's a question that a lot of DSA people, especially in York, as you would know, are reckoning like we have a very successful grassroots election.
Yeah,
How do we make sure these people don't disappear
Yeah.
in the next 4 years?
absolutely.
So I think like in that kind of question, like so many volunteers getting mobilized with like the Obama campaign,
Mhm.
you know, like a lot of them, like that was like their first involvement, like some kind of like grassroots politics
Yeah.
that kind of disappeared, right?
Yeah.
Like I was 3 years old at the time, so I was so like that kind of like ecosystem in the United States. I'm sure it's different elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's different because I think in this case, you were talking about, you know, a specific moment of the Democratic Party. I'm doubt if the Democratic Party actually wanted to absorb it.
Okay.
No.
yeah.
And they did.
Like I doubt,
Right.
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Like that they wanted to absorb.
Yeah.
I wasn't here in the country, so
But it was people who were sometimes pejoratively called sort of anarcho-liberals who.
yeah,
Out of the anarchist turn of the 90s, people went in different directions out of the anarchist scene, and I know a lot of those people, and they became sort of the folks who went into Obama. They were the ones trying to absorb those people.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the party didn't want.
No, the party.
You know, I think that's very that's very important because I think that makes a difference with you know, an organization like DSA that I assume that they want to absorb people.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know, I assume that, so it would be different. And obviously, you know, I mean, it turned out like what the Obama campaign turned out to be, you know, like the administration actually turned out to be, you know. So I think like we should not disregard that people got disappointed, you know, like the people who thought about something different. And then I think it's much more a question about the Democratic Party per se and the relationship and I think it's the broad question of the possibility of a social democratization process
Mhm.
of the Democratic Party, you know, which is a long question in the United States. Like throughout the 20th century, many times, you know, people considered whether you could social democratize the Democratic Party, you know, and I think that the Obama campaign was a moment of that, you know, a 21st instance of, you know, moments in which folks thought about the possibility of turning the Democratic Party into like a social democracy party.
And like an anti-war party also, right?
Yeah, exactly, you know. I mean,
No, I guess the moment in
said now.
2016 with Bernie Sanders was that attempt. And I'm so mad at Bernie at that time because he made us like lose a moment that he had a cross-generational coalition behind him, and he just gave up for the establishment because we want to defeat Trump. And we ended up with Trump being the first, you know,
Now we've got
winning
moved
election.
out.
yeah. But I think that point I think is much more about, you know, in this case, like the two-party system.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
the possibilities of the two-party system,
Exactly.
whether, you know, the two-party system, and that is different, I think, from other countries. You know,
Yeah.
because I don't
That's
think
it.
that, because unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever you want to take it,
Yeah.
there is a different, like in terms in the United States, that when it comes to state power,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
which is part of this conversation here. How do we relate to state power? In the United States, there is an additional layer, which is how do we relate to state power in a two-party system, you know, in which the parties, you know, in many, you know, in many areas are indistinguishable.
Yeah.
You know, so like in many key areas, they are indistinguishable. So how do you relate to that? Like we talked about war, right? So like you don't have an anti-war alternative in just two parties. You know what I mean? Like you have it's a consensus of this party system, you know? So how do you relate to that? So that becomes, you know, and then you can see that for any type of interaction with the state or with the party system requires something like Zoran, you know, which, you know, was an outlier, as, you know, was an outlier in this whole process, you know, like, who knew Mandani? Us, the left of New York. Nobody else knew.
Although I will point out that the same thing happened in Chicago earlier, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, I picked Brandon
Exactly.
Johnson, you know, and he was coming out of, you know, CTU as a
Exactly.
different model. Same thing just happened in Seattle. the same thing almost happened.
But it is an outlier process, I would say. Maybe we are actually changing that.
I think what it points to is you raised the question of party and points to a different kind of approach to the state.
Yeah.
Which is focused on, which is a municipalist
Yeah.
approach, which is what I do think is emerging. It's both strategic, but it's also emerging.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I think there is a part of this conversation, especially in the US and Spain after this moment, was whether the municipal level could be a way in between.
Right.
A way of work out this tension that I mentioned between horizontalism and
Yeah.
top-down approach.
Yeah.
That municipal elections could be municipal level, like the local level, would be a way of working it out. But I don't think that in the decade, right, that gained traction. Here in the US, I do remember going to some municipalist meetings in New York, in which folks wanted to actually craft this as a national strategy. It didn't gain traction because then it was right when, Bernie came out and then all the energy came, to that. But I think there is still a vestige of this process, but then less intentional. You know what I mean? Less intentional in the sense of it's not there are connections.
It's emerging out of the conditions, and there's some intentionality, but it's not like the municipalists themselves aren't actually making it.
I think what I think less intentional in the sense of that happens in different places, but they are not focused on spreading this to other things yet.
And it seems the Trump administration is already sensing it too, and that's why they're attacking it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is actually a threat to explore. Thank you for that.
Well, yeah, it's pretty central, I think, for next system and
Yeah.
the approach that we're.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to say, because I wanted, as a recruitment, so Java and I and Nara were at this conference this past summer,
Yeah.
right? Which was the mobilization conference that takes place every year. And so you can see like already there are good things that come out of that every single time I go. So I just want to encourage people here to think about submitting papers.
Yeah,
They
because they
will
get
be accepted.
students.
Yeah, students get treated with respect
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
And you get a chance to really talk with people in a much closer way than you do at other academic conferences.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that. It was my first time and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my first time as well.
Yeah,
Getting to know them too is important because you're gonna be submitting papers later and things like that. And remember
yeah.
names. It's helpful. Just as part of professional.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and students are treated with respect. That's important. It's not like the essay.
No, it's not.
Oh my gosh, it's just like. This is.
Or a PSA, I'm not going back to that. I tried it once.
Any last questions? Julia, do you have any questions? Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you.
No, I don't have any questions. It was a very good, interesting presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Gabe?
Okay.
No questions, but I'm very happy to be here. It's very, very generative for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.